Imagine you're Tim Cook. It's 2022. You're sitting inside a glass-walled office in Cupertino, looking down at a spreadsheet that feels less like accounting and more like a medical scan. For 20 years, you've built Apple's modern empire on one brutal truth. China wasn't just a factory. China was the factory. Efficient, scalable, ruthlessly competent. When you needed roads, they appeared. When you needed labor, it materialized. When you needed suppliers, an entire ecosystem formed around your demand like iron filings around a magnet. But now, the magnet is cracking. Zero-COVID lockdowns are strangling supply chains with the cold precision of a chokehold. Containers don't move. Workers don't show up. Ports jam. And on top of that, the geopolitical temperature is climbing sanctions. Export controls, chip wars, de-risking, and the quiet realization that your most important partner might eventually become your biggest liability. The golden goose is still laying eggs, but it's starting to look like it might bite. So you need a backup plan. You need a country with a massive labor force, a hunger for growth, and a government hungry enough for your dollars that it will move mountains or at least move paperwork. You look at the map. Your finger lands on the only other place with 1 billion people, India, and instantly, the story writes itself. China is peaking. India is rising. Investment banks chant it like a prayer. Geopolitical strategists repeat it like doctrine. CEOs present it in boardrooms like inevitable destiny. India is portrayed as the democratic successor to China's industrial era, the next engine of global growth. A second factory of the world, a new superpower with a friendlier face. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The hype men in expensive suits rarely say out loud, demography is not destiny. India absolutely has the potential to become the next superpower. But it also has the potential to get trapped in a middle-income limbo so deep it turns entire generations into a statistic. It's one thing to have 1 billion people. It's another thing to turn them into productive workers, competitive industries, and stable institutions. Biology gives you the bodies. Economics has to give them a future. So in this story, we are not just going to stare at shiny GDP charts and pretend they explain everything. We're going to look under the hood. We're going to dissect the demographics, the infrastructure, the bureaucracy, the digital systems, the geopolitical balancing act, and the internal contradictions that could either power India forward or derail it spectacularly. Because India isn't simply the new China. India is a different experiment entirely. A democracy trying to industrialize at planetary scale in an age of automation, climate stress, and fractured globalization. China rose during the era of hyperglobalization when the world wanted cheap labor and didn't ask too many questions. India is rising in the era of strategic supply chains when everyone wants redundancy, resilience, and control. Same race, different weather. Different rules, much higher stakes. To understand why India is being framed as the heir to China's economic role, you have to start with the most seductive argument of all. Demographics. India has youth. Lots of it. India recently overtook China as the world's most populous nation, reaching around 1.4 billion people. But the headline number isn't the real story. The story is the shape of the population. China is aging fast. Decades of the one-child policy created a workforce that is shrinking and a future where fewer young workers must support more retirees. That is not just a social problem. It's a mathematical one. It squeezes growth, strains pensions, and forces governments to choose between welfare and investment. India is the mirror image. Median age roughly 28. China is near 39. The US is around the high 30s. India is projected to add roughly 183 million people to its working-age population between 2020 and 2050. That's not a demographic wave, it's a demographic wall. In theory, this is where the magic happens. Economists call it the demographic dividend, the period when a country has a large working-age population and relatively fewer dependents. If those workers find jobs, productivity rises, consumption expands, savings accumulate, and the economy accelerates. Japan did it in the post-war era. China did it during the factory boom, moving millions from farms into industrial zones. using surplus labor to suppress wages and boost reinvestment until the surplus ran out. This is the Lewis model in motion. It's the engine behind the miracle stories we teach in textbooks. So, the India bulls say, game over. India has the bodies. India has the youth. Even if the government does nothing, a huge cohort of young people buying toothpaste, smartphones, and motorbikes will supposedly deliver 6 to 7% growth for decades. A domestic consumption machine big enough to buffer global recessions. A market so huge it becomes its own gravity. But here's the darker truth. A demographic dividend only pays out if the youth become productive. And right now, the biology is outrunning the economics. In India, the unemployment number is debated, argued, revised like everything else in a democracy. But the deeper problem is harder to deny. Youth unemployment and underemployment remain dangerously high, and graduate unemployment can be brutal. The most frightening scenario is not joblessness alone, but joblessness combined with education, expectations, and internet access, because that is how you get instability. Not quietly, loudly. There's a famous moment that captures this tension like a photograph. Indian Railways advertises roughly 35,000 jobs law-level positions, and over 12 million people apply. 12 million. That's not a labor market. That's a pressure cooker. It's a nation of young people staring at a narrow doorway, shoving forward, desperate to squeeze through. And then comes the second problem, employability. Many Indian graduates carry degrees that are real on paper and fragile in practice. The education system, in many regions, still rewards memorization over skills. China spent decades building vocational training to feed factories. India built a vast web of colleges, some excellent, many mediocre. Some essentially degree mills producing graduates who can recite theory but struggle with practical execution. So the verdict on the demographic miracle is simple. India has the raw materials for a superpower. But raw materials don't build themselves into a machine. If India can move workers from low-productivity agriculture into high-productivity factories and modern services, the country becomes a global force. If it fails, that youth bulge doesn't become a dividend. It becomes a liability, a massive cohort of people who feel promised a future and then denied it. And when that happens, GDP projections don't matter. Because you can't eat projections. You can't feed a generation with PowerPoint. This is the first fork in the road. Lottery ticket, or time bomb. And now, the second fork. Even if India has the workers, can it build the engine that China mastered better than any country in history? Manufacturing. Because software engineers in Bangalore can drive nice cars, but they cannot employ hundreds of millions of people in rural India. For that, you need factories. You need assembly lines. You need supply chains. You need ports, roads, power, and predictable execution. You need to make the elephant dance. And that is where the story turns from demographic promise into mechanical reality. If demographics are the fuel, then manufacturing is the engine. And right now, India is trying to swap out a lawnmower motor for a V8 while the car is already moving on a road full of potholes, checkpoints, and paperwork. For the last 30 years, the global division of labor was brutally simple. China made things. India fixed things. China became the factory of the world by mastering supply chains like an art form. If you needed a screw, a circuit board, and a plastic casing, you could find all of them within a short drive of Shenzhen. The entire ecosystem was stacked tightly together. Suppliers, logistics, ports, labor, and government coordination, like a machine designed for one purpose: scale. India, meanwhile, became the world's back office. IT services, consulting, call centers, and English-speaking talent engine that plugged into Western capitalism perfectly. And it worked. It's created a modern professional class. It lifted millions. But it also had a hard ceiling. You cannot become a true superpower on IT services alone. Not when you're trying to absorb hundreds of millions of new workers over the next decades. Services create wealth, but they don't always create mass employment. A software campus can generate billions in market cap while employing a fraction of the workforce that a manufacturing belt would employ. The real question isn't whether India can create billion-dollar companies. It's whether it can create 100 million steady jobs. And that's why manufacturing matters. This is where Make in India enters like a political slogan that must become an economic reality. It becomes a national disappointment. Factories are not glamorous. They are loud, hot, and repetitive. They are grime, steel, machines, and human coordination. But historically, factories are how poor countries become rich because factories turn surplus labor into productivity. Here's the problem. For a long time, India's logistics were punishing. Picture it like this. You're a logistics manager. In China, moving a container from an inland factory to a port is like sliding a puck across ice smooth, predictable, optimized, and often subsidized. In India, especially a decade ago, it was more like an obstacle course designed by a sadist, fractured roads, state border checks that took hours or days, inconsistent regulations, facilitation payments, and rail networks where freight trains had to wait behind passenger traffic like a delivery truck stuck behind a parade. And then you hit the cold, hard math that kills competitiveness: logistics cost. For years, India's logistics costs hovered around 13 to 14% of GDP, while China and developed economies often sat closer to 8 to 9%. That difference is not a rounding error. That difference is your profit margin. It's the line between being globally competitive and being a charity case. It's why in the past, it could be cheaper for an Indian company to import goods from China than to ship them from one Indian state to another. So when people say India is the new China, they often forget that China didn't become China by having workers alone. It became China by making movement cheap, fast, and reliable. Supply chains don't just require labor. They require predictability. But here's where the story becomes interesting. India is not asleep anymore. India is currently on an infrastructure binge that looks almost unreal when you see it in numbers. Highways expanding at an aggressive pace. Ports modernizing, new airports. Massive capex spending that signals something important. The state has decided that physical connectivity is no longer optional. Then comes the big one, almost a plot twist for anyone who remembers. India's old freight bottlenecks, dedicated freight corridors. The concept is simple, and that's why it's powerful. Build rail lines used primarily for cargo, not passengers. No more freight waiting behind commuter trains. No more goods crawling across the map. If executed well, this compresses economic distance. It turns days into hours. And in a manufacturing economy, speed is money. Now add another weapon in the arsenal: subsidy wars. India's production linked. Incentive schemes. The plea programs are basically a direct message to global companies. If you produce here, we will pay you for it. Not with vague promises. With cash incentives tied to output. It's industrial policy dressed in modern clothing. And it's designed to do one thing: pull supply chains away from China and into Indian territory. The China Plus One strategy is no longer a theory, it's a construction site. Look at Apple. A few years ago, Apple made essentially 0 iPhones in India. Then the numbers started to move. Today, a meaningful share of iPhones are assembled in India. And Foxconn and other suppliers are building major campuses across states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. For Western multinationals, India's pitch is clear. Huge workforce, huge market, and geopolitical safety compared to total dependence on China. But this is where the new China fantasy hits its first concrete wall. Concrete is easy to pour. Laws are harder to change. Here is the core difference between China and India that no spreadsheet can erase. China is authoritarian. India is democratic. In China, if the state wants a dam, villages are moved. If it wants an industrial zone, land is seized, compensation is dictated, and dissent is suppressed. It's brutal, often inhumane, but it is efficient. China's economic miracle was partly built on the speed of command. India is loud. India is legal. India is political. India is contested. If you want to build a factory in India, you have to acquire land. And land in India is not just land. It is identity, ancestry, legal complexity, and endless litigation. Titles are disputed. Records are messy. Courts are slow. Protests can erupt. Elections can change the rules mid-project. There's a famous example that shows how lethal this uncertainty can be. The Tata Nano plant. Tata Motors tried to build a factory to produce the world's cheapest car. Land disputes and protests escalated into a political crisis. Tata abandoned the partially built plant and moved to another state. For foreign investors, stories like that don't read as democracy in action. They read as billion-dollar project risk. Because you cannot build a $10 billion semiconductor fab if you fear a court order will freeze construction for 5 years. So, is India becoming a manufacturing hub? Yes, progress is real. The roads are improving, the ports are improving. The policy intent is serious. But is India becoming China 2.0? Not in the old sense. India's manufacturing share of GDP has been stubborn around the mid-teens for years, far from the ambitious targets politicians love to announce. The country is improving, but the scale and speed required to replicate China's industrial dominance is immense. And here's the more modern truth that makes the new China idea feel outdated. The world probably doesn't want a new single factory of the world. It wants a distributed network. Vietnam, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Eastern Europe, supply chains spreading like branches instead of concentrating like a pillar. Your iPhone might be assembled in India, but the screen could still come from Korea. The chip from Taiwan or the US, and certain components from, yes, still China. India is joining the supply chain, is not replacing it. Which means India's real challenge isn't just building factories. It's building the conditions that make factories scale, faster land processes, clearer regulations, more flexible labor systems, and above all, predictable governance. And now, we reach the next reveal. Because while India is still wrestling with steel and concrete manufacturing, there is one domain where India has arguably leapfrogged the West, and maybe even outpaced China. Digital public infrastructure. Not apps, not startups, not private monopolies. A national digital rail system that can turn poverty into participation, and participation into surveillance. This is the India stack. If manufacturing is where India is still struggling to catch up, digital public infrastructure is where India has quietly sprinted ahead of almost everyone, including China and the United States. In the West, digital finance evolved like a patchwork. Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, Zelle let private walled gardens that don't always talk to each other. In China, the system is efficient but centralized around private giants like WeChat Pay and Alipay, corporate empires that own both your payments and your data. India looked at both models and made a radical decision. Instead of letting private platforms build the rails, the state would build the rails itself. What emerged is something economists now call the India stock asset of interoperable. Government-backed digital systems that sit underneath the entire economy. At its core is UPI, the Unified Payments Interface. The design is deceptively simple. Any app can connect, any bank can participate. Scan a QR code, tap a button, and money moves instantly from one bank account to another. No fees, no friction, no monopoly. The scale is almost hard to believe. In 2016, India processed just a few million UPI transactions. By late 2024, it was processing tens of billions of transactions every month, more real-time digital payments than the US, Europe, and China combined. This isn't just convenience, it is a structural shift. Cash-heavy informal economies don't disappear overnight, but digital rails pull them into the light. UPI doesn't stand alone. It's part of a broader architecture, often summarized as JAM. Jan-Dan, hundreds of millions of zero-balance bank accounts forcibly opened for the poor. Aadhaar, a biometric digital ID covering nearly the entire population. Fingerprints, iris scans, identity tied to everything. Mobile, ultra-cheap data driven by brutal competition, making smartphones nearly universal. Together, this system did something historic. It collapsed the cost of participation. A migrant worker in Mumbai used to send money home through informal agents who skimmed fees and occasionally vanished. Today, he taps a screen and the money arrives instantly in a village account. Welfare payments no longer leak through layers of middlemen. Subsidies hit accounts directly. The state can reach people it could never reliably reach before. To the India bulls, this is the greatest financial inclusion experiment in human history. And they're not entirely wrong. The India stack has formalized vast portions of the economy almost overnight. It has boosted productivity, reduced corruption, and given the government a powerful fiscal transmission mechanism. But every system that increases efficiency also increases control. This is where the story shifts from optimism to unease. Aadhaar is not optional. To open a bank account, to file taxes, to get a SIM card, to receive benefits. Your biometric identity is the key that unlocks modern life. And when everything is digital, everything is trackable. In theory, this is benign. In practice, it introduces a new kind of risk. Data security, for one, is fragile. Reports have surfaced of massive data breaches, hundreds of millions of personal records exposed, sold, traded. In many countries, a breach of that scale would trigger resignations and parliamentary inquiries. In India, it barely pauses the news cycle. Then there's the issue of internet shutdowns. India holds a strange global record. It leads the world in government-ordered internet blackouts. Protests, riots, exams, elections, the response is often the same pull, the plug. Dozens of shutdowns in a single year, affecting millions of people. In a digital-first economy, this is not a minor inconvenience. It's a systemic vulnerability. You cannot run a fintech ecosystem if connectivity disappears on command. You cannot build investor confidence when digital infrastructure is subject to political weather. India has built a Ferrari of a payment system, but it's driving on roads where the traffic lights don't work and the police can cut the engine whenever they want. And yet, despite these risks, the India stack is real power. It creates data. Data creates insight. Insight creates leverage. Which brings us to the next layer of India's rise: geopolitics. Because while India is wiring its population into a digital state and trying to industrialize at scale, it is also performing one of the most delicate balancing acts in modern international relations, playing every major power against the others without falling into any single camp. This is not neutrality. This is multi-alignment. India does not think like the West. It does not see the world as a moral chessboard divided into good and evil blocks. It sees the world as a marketplace, and it intends to extract maximum advantage from every counterparty. The clearest example arrived in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. The West imposed sanctions designed to cripple Moscow's economy, especially its energy exports. Europe and the United States stopped buying Russian oil and expected the rest of the world to follow. India did the opposite. Before the war, Russia was a marginal supplier to India. After the sanctions, Russian oil was suddenly cheap, deeply discounted. Indian refiners stepped in and bought massive volumes. Within a year, Russia became one of India's top oil suppliers. But here's the twist. India didn't just burn that oil domestically. It refined it into diesel and jet fuel and sold it on the global market, including to Europe. The same Europe that had banned Russian crude was happily buying Indian fuel refined from Russian oil. Sanctions laundering executed with spreadsheets and tankers. Was it cynical? Yes. Was it effective? Also yes. Global energy prices stayed lower than they otherwise would have. India saved billions. And the West looked the other way because $200 oil would have detonated Western politics faster than any speech in the UN. Indian officials defended the move bluntly. India has 1.4 billion people. Energy affordability is not a preference, it's survival. Moral lectures don't power factories or air conditioners. This was strategic autonomy in action. But playing all sides has consequences. While India was buying oil from Russia, it was also deepening military and technological ties with the United States to counter China. The US sees India as the essential counterweight in Asia. But partners get nervous when autonomy turns into unpredictability. That nervousness spiked when accusations surfaced of Indian intelligence operations targeting dissidents abroad. Diplomatic freezes followed. Trust frayed. Quiet alarm bells rang in Western capitals. India, it became clear, is not a junior partner. It is a power with its own agenda, and that power has one glaring vulnerability: defense dependence. For decades, India relied heavily on Russian military hardware: tanks, jets, engines, spare parts. But Russia is now stretched, sanctioned, and struggling to supply even its own forces. India is racing to pivot, buying drones from the US, jets from France, engines from Western firms, but military supply chains don't transform overnight. If conflict erupts before that transition is complete, India's position becomes dangerously complex. Which brings us to the core question of this section. India is building factories. India is wiring its population into a digital state. India is playing global powers against each other. But all of this assumes one thing remains intact: internal stability. Because the greatest risk to India's rise is not China, it is not the US, it is not Russia. It is the fault line running straight through India itself. And that fault line separates to India's one soaring into billionaire wealth and one scraping by on $5 days. That is where the story turns next. If you want to understand India's present hand, its risk, you don't need a balance sheet. You need a taxi ride. Land in Mumbai and you're greeted by a gleaming international terminal that feels like a monument to confidence. Marble floors, designer stores, art installations, air conditioning that smells like money. It whispers a story the India bulls love to tell: modern, ambitious, open for business. Then the taxi pulls onto the highway. Within minutes, you pass one of Asia's largest slum stents, improvised, alive with survival. 1 million people compressed into an area smaller than a major park in Manhattan. Informal homes, informal labor, informal lives, powering a formal economy that rarely acknowledges them. This isn't just inequality, it's duality. Economists call it a K-shaped economy. Picture the letter K. After a shock like the pandemic, the top arm shoots upward while the bottom arm slides down. In India, the pandemic didn't just widen gaps, it exposed them. The formal sector, the wealthy, the digitally connected rebounded quickly. Stock markets soared. Billionaires multiplied. Luxury consumption exploded. Meanwhile, the informal sector, small traders, rural workers, daily wage earners, struggled to recover. The data is stark. India now has one of the highest concentrations of wealth on earth. The top slice of society controls a disproportionate share of national assets, while the bottom half owns very little. In historical terms, inequality today rivals or exceeds levels seen under colonial rule. That is not a statistic. It's a warning. Look at consumption patterns and you see the split clearly. Sales of luxury SUVs, high-end apartments, premium smartphones, booming. Apple opens flagship stores and lines form around the block, but basic goods tell a different story. Entry-level motorcycles slow. Rural consumption stagnates. Even staple soap biscuits, low-cost clothing show softness in poorer regions. When people cut back on hygiene, inflation isn't abstract. It's intimate. The defenders of this model argue it's a necessary phase. They point to history. South Korea in the 1960s and 70s concentrated power in massive conglomerates. Chaebol handed them cheap capital, protected them from competition, and told them to conquer global markets. Samsung, Hyundai, LG emerged. Inequality rose, but so did national wealth. Eventually, the gains spread. India appears to be running a similar playbook, backing national champions to build ports, airports, power grids, data networks. These groups have the scale to execute projects the state cannot manage alone. Speed matters. Scale matters. And yes, some people get obscenely rich along the way. But here's the line. India is flirting with, and it's a dangerous one. There is a difference between national champions and oligarchs. When a handful of conglomerates operate airports, control ports, generate power, transmit data, and influence media narratives, markets stop being competitive. Innovation slows. Risk concentrates. The economy becomes brittle. A shock to one giant can ripple across the entire system. We saw a preview of this fragility when allegations against a major conglomerate sent shockwaves through markets. Stocks plunged. Banks reassessed exposure. Investors suddenly asked the question that haunts every concentrated economy. What happens if one of these pillars cracks? This is systemic risk dressed as development, and all of it sits atop a society that is politically and culturally volatile. India's rise is often framed as a democratic alternative to China, country with cultural depth, English fluency, and a massive diaspora embedded in Western institutions. And that diaspora is a real asset. Indian-born executives lead global corporations. Remittances pour in over $100 billion a year, providing a steady inflow of foreign currency that stabilizes the rupee. This is soft power converted into hard cash. But domestic politics tell a more complicated story. Under the current political order, India has embraced a sharper, more muscular nationalism. Supporters argue it creates unity and confidence. Critics warn it fuels polarization. The reality is that capital is allergic to chaos. It does not care about ideology. It cares about predictability. Communal tensions, regional unrest, and periodic violence create headlines that investors cannot ignore. Internet shutdowns, security deployments, states paralyzed by unrest, these are not side notes. They are red flags. You cannot run global supply chains in an environment that feels combustible. And then there is the invisible enemy that ignores ideology entirely: nature. India's economic future is colliding head-on with climate reality. Air pollution chokes productivity in major cities. Heat waves push human limits. Wet bulb temperatures approach thresholds where outdoor labor becomes lethal. Roads melt. Power demand spikes. Factories slow. Schools close. This is not a future scenario. It's happening now. India is racing into green energy solar parks the size of cities, ambitious renewable targets, electric vehicles. But energy demand is exploding faster than clean supply can scale. Coal still dominates. Every new air conditioner, every new factory, every new data center pulls on a grid that relies heavily on fossil fuels. India is trapped in a paradox. To get rich enough to fight climate change, it must burn the fuels that make climate change worse. This is where comparisons to China become misleading. China industrialized in a cooler, more forgiving climate with centralized control. India is industrializing under democratic constraints in one of the most climate-vulnerable regions on Earth. So when people ask whether India is the new China, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is whether India can balance growth with stability, concentration with inclusion, autonomy with cooperation, and ambition with restraint all at the same time, because the margin for error is shrinking. And now we arrive at the final reckoning. Not what India could become in theory, but what happens if it succeeds or if it fails. So, let's return to the question that pulled us into this story in the first place. Is India the new China? The honest answer is yes and no. Yes, in the only sense that truly matters. India is the only country left with the scale, the ambition, and the human capital large enough to meaningfully alter the gravity of the global economy. 1 billion-plus people, a young workforce, a growing industrial base, a massive domestic market, a diaspora embedded at the highest levels of global power. No other nation checks all those boxes at once. But no, because India will never be China in the way China was. China's rise was engineered by a centralized state during a brief historical window when globalization rewarded speed, scale, and obedience. India is attempting something far messier. It is trying to industrialize at continental scale inside a democracy. Under constant political noise, legal friction, climate stress, and global scrutiny, roads take longer. Policies are debated in public. Protests slow projects. Courts intervene. Elections change priorities. This makes India slower. It also makes India harder to predict. And prediction not potentially is what capital ultimately chases. If India succeeds, it will not look like China's miracle. It will look uneven, chaotic, regionally lopsided. But it could still lift hundreds of millions out of poverty and anchor a multipolar world where no single country dominates global production. That is the upside. It is enormous. But the downside is just as large. If the demographic dividend turns into a demographic disaster, millions of young people remain underemployed. Frustrated and digitally connected without opportunity, the political consequences will be severe. If wealth continues to concentrate while basic consumption stalls, resentment will grow. If communal tensions spill beyond managed levels, capital will flee. If climate stress accelerates faster than adaptation, productivity will collapse in precisely the regions meant to power growth. Unlike China, there is no single control room in India. No lever that can be pulled to impose order at scale. India is 1 billion people arguing in the front seat of a speeding car, somehow managing most of the time to avoid the guardrail at the last second. That chaos is India's weakness. It is also its strength. Because the same openness that slows decisions also creates resilience. The same noise that frustrates planners allows correction. India has stumbled repeatedly in the past yet it keeps adjusting, recalibrating, and moving forward. That is why so many investors, strategists, and governments are willing to bet on it, despite the risks. The world quietly needs India to succeed. Not because India is perfect, but because the alternative world, where China slows, the West ages, supply chains fracture, and the largest emerging economy fails, is far worse. If India collapses under its own contradictions, the shock will not be local. It will be global. So we are watching the largest economic experiment in human history unfold in real time. A democratic giant trying to do in decades what others did under very different conditions. A country balancing ambition against entropy, youth against jobs, freedom against order, growth against heat. India may become the defining power of the century, or it may become a cautionary tale about potential wasted at planetary scale. The unsettling truth is this: both futures are plausible. And the choice between them is not being made in a single office by a single leader or by a single policy. It is being made every day in classrooms, factories, villages, boardrooms, and voting booths by a billion people moving forward together imperfectly. The new China is not inevitable. It is a gamble. And the world is all, whether it realizes it or not.